Okay, welcome back. We're at week 10, and I hope you guys are all doing okay. We had an earthquake this morning. That was exciting. So, last week, we talked a little bit about what New Zealand game development looked like, and hopefully you guys took some time to explore other different game companies out there and see if there's anything cool happening. This week, we're going to take a look at what an individual might look like in game development, and specifically what kind of roles and jobs are available in different game companies. So we're going to be looking specifically at types of work that you can do in the industry, and this is to give you a sense of the specialization that happens in game development. So if any of these particular jobs sound interesting to you, you can start focusing your own learning here at Massey to target those particular positions. So a lot of this is going to come back to that illustration that I showed in week 1 about how game development works through design, art and code, testing, and delivery. And how it all kind of wraps together. And so we'll kind of go through these positions from those type of disciplines. So we'll be initially looking at production and design. Then I think we're going on to code and art, and then testing and other miscellaneous stuff towards the end. Now, with each of these positions, some of them will have this little check mark next to it. And this check mark means that it's a position that is relatively entry level. So these are the positions that chances are good that you would be either getting or aiming to get out of university. So pay particular attention to those positions because those will be the ones that you'll probably want to do searching for as you start developing your portfolio and start putting yourself out there. Okay, starting from the top. We're going to take a look at the executive producer. The executive producer is sort of the main person on a project, and by main, it means that they are in charge of making sure the project gets done on a very, very large scale. So that means they are the person who is driving the funding. They might be the person who is putting up the money for the funding, but otherwise they are gathering the funding as a whole. They tend to be in charge of IP or intellectual property. That doesn't necessarily mean that they own it, but they are in charge of it. And lastly, they are in charge of the gross deadlines like release date and things like that. So they are the person who is sort of at the top of the pyramid, making the very, very high level decisions about game production. Step down from that would be producer, and they run production. So they're in charge of the team, not only in terms of assembling the team and getting the correct talents in, but also making sure that team is running correctly. So that's working on interpersonal relationships. It's working on pipeline, production pipeline, to make sure that everybody is working at their best capacity. Everyone's getting along. They're in charge of the sort of micro deadlines. So that would be not only things like alpha, beta, and goal release deadlines, but also on a weekly basis, the type of deadlines that the entire team will be working towards. Which brings us to things like sprints. So there are many different types of production in game development, and one type is called Agile or Scrum. And that type of development works in these weekly or bi-weekly sprints in which you take a week and develop one particular type of functionality. So the producer will be in charge of that as well. Lastly, producer is definitely in charge of budgeting, not only in terms of budgeting for staff, but also probably working with, if you have an office manager, making sure that the rent is paid, making sure that all the licensing is paid for all the different types of software that you have. And also in charge of maintaining the balances in terms of once you actually start making money from a given game. So they are in charge of not only the output of money, but the input of money, and making sure that it's all taxed in the right way and is all being distributed to the right people. Okay, lastly, on the production side of things, you have an associate producer, and the associate producer job is pretty open to interpretation based upon what the company needs, but usually they are there to help the producer. So that might be everything from taking notes from weekly meetings and typing them up, It could be answering emails and answering questions from the team. It could be gathering information from the various funding sources, like from the Apple Store and the Google Store and Steam or wherever else, and kind of collating all that financial data as well. It's kind of a catch-all term for someone who helps out the producer. Okay, at the top of the design ladder is the game designer. The game designer is in charge of the actual game itself, the contents of the game. They're the ones who are defining what the game looks like, what gameplay looks like. They are defining the main sort of psychological and behavioral outcomes for the game. So what type of environments, what type of responses they're hoping to get from the game. And overall designing mechanics, putting together scripts and narrative, and often they are the people who own the IP. So they own the intellectual property for that particular game. They're also in charge of the game team itself. So they'll be the people who are proposing what roles are needed on the game team, and who might fulfill those roles. Okay, also you've got a level designer, and a level designer is different than a game designer, and I think we've gone over this before, whereas a game designer designs the mechanics of the game itself, the level designer implements those mechanics in interesting ways. So they are creating the level-based goals, so they are sort of defining what needs to be, what the player needs to accomplish in this given level, and how they can use the mechanics established by the game designer in order to accomplish those goals. They'll also do a ton of playtesting on their given level and other people's levels, and pulling all sorts of metrics in terms of figuring out how their game is played, how successful they are in using those mechanics to achieve the goals that they want out of that level. So level designer is very, very practical position. There's a lot of nitty gritty goes on in level design. It's a really, really cool position to have. Underneath that, you've got a junior game or junior level designer. They are primarily in charge of either doing things like set dressing or scene dressing, in which the main sort of flow of the level is created by the level designer, but then the sort of aesthetics of it are done by a junior level designer, where they're basically taking the assets that are made by the artist and placing them in the right position. It's not changing the mechanics or the behavior of the level, but they're just sort of populating it with stuff. They're also going to be deeply involved with playtesting, so setting up playtests, doing all of the recording for playtests, whether that's video recording or pulling data after gameplay, and analyzing all those metrics. Okay, also in a ton of games, you'll have a writer, and they'll be the ones who are working on the narrative, the overall arching narrative of the game, but also working on dialogue and possibly working on user interface as well. So they are probably traditional writers as such, and have worked their way into non-linear and interactive narrative. Related to that, you have translators and localizers. We spoke about this a couple weeks ago. So they're working on translation, transliteration, and culturalization, basically taking the content for any game and making it applicable both in terms of language but also in terms of content to different cultures and different countries. Okay, so that's it on kind of the gold team. And now we're going to go to programming. And the top of the pyramid on the programming side of stuff and the code side of stuff is your lead engineer. And the lead engineer is in charge of all the code. They are ultimately responsible for all the code. And as such, they are the people who will do the initial code design. So you generally, as a lead engineer, you don't just start hacking stuff in unless you're doing a prototype. But if you're actually building a full game, what you want to do is do the initial code design or the architecture. And you want to set up how all the different components of the game are going to work together in a very abstract way, and then that will be implemented with actual code by people underneath you. So that's the initial code design. Just like the lead game designer and lead artist, lead engineer is also responsible for team management. So that's choosing your team members and making sure they're all working together. And they're also in charge of any sort of refactoring that happens. And refactoring is that process that we go through towards the end of each project, in which we take a look at the existing code and see how they can make it better or more flexible and more usable. Underneath the lead engineer, you've got a ton of engineers, and they are responsible for implementing that architecture that the lead engineer sets up. So they are coding day in and day out. They are creating all of the functionality that a game needs, which is fairly broad. I will be going through and breaking up the different specializations of engineer, so you can take a look at different types of engineering that's out there, or coding or programming. So they're in charge of code. They're also doing test suites in which they're developing different ways of testing the game as it gets developed, as opposed to at the end when the game actually gets produced or gets released internally, where a tester takes over after the fact. This is during development they do a bunch of testing. So let's take a look at the different types of engineers out there, and I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. So you've got a graphics engineer, and they work on graphics. They work on making sure that the game can push as many triangles and textures as they possibly can. And they tend to work directly on the GPU, on the video card. And they are highly specialized in optimization, making sure that things are going as quickly as possible, leveraging the most recent hardware architecture improvements so they can push as much graphic stuff as they possibly can. Gameplay engineers are working specifically with the designers to develop code for specific functionality. So if there's particular gameplay that doesn't exist in one of the, in Unreal or Unity, then the gameplay engineer would be brought on to work with the designer to implement that gameplay. AI engineer is working on state machines, behavior trees, genetic algorithms, basically ways to make the game more intelligent. And that could be your opponents becoming more intelligent, but it could be a whole bunch of other stuff that's going on behind the scenes in which you're leveraging artificial intelligence to make your game smarter. Network engineers working specifically with network code, so that's usually multiplayer code. They are trying to remove as many latencies as possible and do as much optimization as possible. And there's a lot of tricks that actually go into network engineering that you might not be aware of. They are actually network engineers in all of the AAA network games, in which they are anticipating the move you are going to make before you do it. And this is something that was developed in sort of side-scrolling fighting games like Mortal Kombat, in which their job, in order to make latency much, much smaller, was to anticipate what the player will do at any given point in time, which is kind of fascinating and kind of weird at the same time. A back-end engineer is someone who's probably coming from the web side of engineering, but they're the ones who are working on database integration and web-based coding. And this also ties in with multiplayer stuff, because a lot of that state, especially for turn-based multiplayer games, is stored on databases. And so they're the ones making sure the database is correctly architectured and running smoothly as possible. Character engineer is working with artificial intelligence, concept designers, and technical artists to make characters as cool as possible. So that could be doing emotional engines for facial animation. It could be doing special code to make clothing work correctly. Whatever it is in terms of character stuff, then the character engineer will be working on that. And lastly, on the blue side, on the engineering side of stuff, we have a tools engineer. And a tools engineer, their job is to make everybody else's work easier with tools. So they are developing packages that can be dropped into Maya. They're developing stuff for Unreal or Unity or whatever engine they're using. They're working with quality assurance. They're working with other engineers. They're working technical artists to basically make really, really cool tools for people to use. Okay, now sort of blending in with this is you've got your testing or quality assurance. And what testers do is that they take an existing product, and that could be not only the end results, like the final beta, but it could also be the weekly build for that week at really early on in the game. And they start testing it. They start doing different types of tests to make sure that the game is behaving correctly, that it's not doing weird stuff. So you have memory leaks, so it's not doing stuff where the player can break walls or go to places that they're not allowed to go. And there's a whole suite of different things that testers can do. I will be doing a short lecture later, I believe next week or the week after, giving a little bit more information about the different types of tests that you can do, because testing is super important to game development, and I want you guys to know as much as possible about it. It's also a really, really good way to get into the industry. There's a lot of public tests that happen in Wellington with different companies. Places like PikPok will do an open call on the Wellington game developers, saying, hey, we need testers on Saturday, come on down. Go to those. Absolutely go to those. Check them out. And start talking to people, because they are people who are already in the industry and who are working. There was a CMP graduate named Dylan who just kept going to PikPok's testing, open testing, and kept making really good observations and kept returning really good test reports, and they eventually hired him as a tester. And then once he was hired as a tester, he was able to pivot within the company, and now he's a junior designer in PikPok, which is super cool. So keep that in mind. Further on the track, you have test engineers, or engineers in test, they're called. And they are people who directly, they're engineers, so they're actually coding in order to make those tests more robust. So there's different types of tests, but there's particular types of tests that operate best when a computer does them, often called stress tests or sweat tests. And so engineers in test will design those tests and implement them. Okay, so that's it on the sort of bluey purple side of stuff. Next up, on the green side of things, we got the art director. And again, this is the top of the pyramid on art. They are in charge of all of the art. They are in charge of the team for art. And they are the final arbitrator of any approval process when art is created. So they are in charge of the art, which is a fairly big deal. Like there's a lot to do. The best art directors will be really good at developing art Bibles, they're called, which basically explain the art style as clearly as possible, so when other artists come in, they can replicate that style as efficiently as possible. Which is a very, very particular skill, and it's really, really rare to be able to break apart an art style into its constituent components so that it can be easily replicable. There's a lot of artists out there who are very intuitive, and they paint very well and they draw very well, but you ask them to explain what they do and they fall flat. So you'll often see that the best artists are not the best art directors, because it's a different skill, and being a good art director, yes, you have to be a good artist, but it's almost more important to be able to communicate how to do that art than it is to be a really, really good artist. Underneath the art director are lead artists, and lead artists are in charge of any given team. They're in charge of the budget for that team, and they're the front line for approvals for that team. So they will be working on more of a daily or weekly cycle, as opposed to the art director, who's working more on a sort of bi-weekly or monthly cycle. The lead artist is working on a daily or weekly cycle, making sure that everyone on the team is busy making art. They are the ones that are making sure that the artists that are working are conforming to that art Bible. And if they have any questions, then they'll escalate that question to the art director. But they are the people who are most directly applying that art Bible to any given work. So as a lead artist, you are working in spreadsheets, you are working in Trello boards, you are doing approvals, and you are an artist at the same time. It's a tricky job to have, for sure. Then you've just got artists, and their job is to make art, and to make art to particular requirements as laid out by the art asset list and as laid out by the art Bible. So again, just being a good artist is not good enough. More often than not, you'll be working in someone else's style. So being a good artist who can replicate other people's styles is super important. But probably the most important skill that any artist can have is to take criticism well, because it is fairly rare for an artist to be able to do that. But it's super, super important in any team-based project for an artist who can be, quite emotionally attached to their work, to be able to let that go, listen to constructive criticism, take it on board, and change the art that they do have. So that's a really important part of being an artist. Then I kind of want to break down the same way that we did for the engineering side of stuff. I want to break down kind of what happens for specialization on the art side of stuff. So you have a concept artist, and their job is to make 2D art. So they're not doing any 3D stuff. They might use 3D tools, but ultimately they're making a static 2D image. And that not only could be a beautiful scene of an environmental scene for environmental concept art. It could be a character design, but it could be also a character design that then gets rolled out to a T or an A pose and a turnaround. So which is very, very technical drawing that needs to be as clear as possible so a modeler can come in there and replicate it, which you couldn't normally do with like a beauty shot from a concept artist. A texture artist is someone who takes 3D work and basically wraps textures around that 3D work. Up until the last couple of years, a lot of that has been UV unwrapping, UV aliasing, or atlasing, and creating textures by hand in Photoshop. These days, a lot of texture work is being handled through shaders, so custom shaders in Engine, and also through packages like Substance, where they're able to procedurally generate textures without having to go in there manually and paint every single texture. So that's kind of the future of being a texture artist, is much more technical and much more procedural. Environment artist, I've got a big click to add text there, that shouldn't be there, is someone who works in the environment. So there are people who are not only doing the walls and the set dressing, they're also doing landscape work. They're creating the static environment around the gameplay. As opposed to a character artist who is working more on the character stuff, and they'll be doing a lot more, paying a lot more attention to animation than environment artist will. They'll be paying a lot more attention to things like skin, which is super tricky, and facial features and animation in general. A prop artist is someone who effectively makes the crates, the stuff that the props that might be pickups, or they might be just set dressing. But a prop artist is a junior position in which they make all the sort of not glorious stuff that goes into the game. The plants, the trash cans, the bits of scrunched up paper on the floor, they're all those different types of props are designed by the prop artist. And where it says B and C list, that's from where the asset lists get divided up into different priorities. So the A priorities are all those assets that absolutely need to be in the game and they need to be beautiful. They get handed off to more senior people. The B list tends to be the stuff that needs to be in the game but doesn't need to be handled by a senior person. And C list tends to be those objects that if they don't make it into the game, that's okay. So prop artist, junior position, they're handling B and C list stuff. A UI artist is someone who is doing the UI design. So they're creating the interface not only for in-game heads-up display interface, but also all the other static screens for game selection, options, stuff like that go into the game. They're also designing the user experience, how the user flows from one part of the game into another part of the game. And for those of you who did take a look at Mini Metro, the UX is really cool in that because it all sorts of fit in. It fits in with the whole metaphor for the game. It's really, their UI is really, really beautiful in that game. Animators, they do animation. They take existing assets and make them move. There's a lot of animators who kind of avoid working in games, which is a shame. There is a lot of stuff in games that is cycle work. So they're making walk cycles, they're doing reload cycles, basically these small snippets of animation that might not have the sort of glory of narrative animation, but there's still some really cool challenges. And because of that sort of nature, there's actually quite a lot of animation positions out there that are available. So even though going straight from university into an animation position is tricky, it's not impossible to do. Technical artist. Technical artist is someone who, I put centaur here, but they're basically two different creatures. They are not only a really good artist, but they have really good coding chops as well. So they can draw. and they can see a piece of art and analyze it and break it apart and know what's going on in the art stuff, but they can also implement stuff in code. So there are often people who are doing the shaders. There are often people who are creating the skeletal structures for characters, the necks on dragons, the way that the armor moves as they lift up an arm and folds into itself. Stuff like that that needs an aesthetic eye, needs the ability to see when something visually looks correct, but also needs to have this really strong technical base. They are extremely rare. And if you have those abilities in both those fields, then your skills will be in demand. To be able to be a good technical artist means that you can not only work in games, but you can go work in film, you can go work in animation, you can work in a whole bunch of different places. So being able to develop both of those sides of your brain is really, really useful, and it will make you a very versatile person. Okay, related to that, you have an effects artist, and they are people who are designing the in-game effects using tools like Shuriken, which is the existing system in Unity. And then Unity now has in development a new VFX system called the VFX Stack. On the Unreal side of stuff, you've got Niagara and some other different types of systems. So you're basically using those tools, in-game tools, to be able to develop effects. And you're also leveraging things like Houdini and these sort of out-of-game tools to be able to do like fluid flows and stuff like that that can't happen in runtime. Excuse me. Ooh, 26 minutes. Let's keep going. So rigger. A rigger is someone who is a technical artist, but they are specifically focused on working between an artist and an animator to make the character rig as good as possible. Very, very tricky, but will give you plenty of job security. They'll always need riggers. Shader artists, again, this is someone who is working probably alongside artists and texture artists in order to make the math behind the shaders work well. So to make sure that the translucency is happening. If it needs to glow, it needs to glow in a particular way. And shader artists are now doing things that it can affect the geometry of the world. So like in most recent games, the Hammer of Dawn thing example, where it's like shattering everything as it hits. Stuff like that will all be handled by a shader artist. So they are people who are artists but have really, really strong technical chops. Okay, so now leaving the world of art and kind of going into the miscellany of game design, you've got sound designers, and they make the pew pew pews and the jant jant boops. So they make the sounds for the game. They are recording the voice actors. They are generating all the beeps and boops. They are in charge of diegetic and non-diegetic sounds. So diegetic sounds are all the sounds that happen in the game. Non-diegetic sounds might be the user interface sounds. So when they click a button to get to the options, and that sound needs to be designed. It's the background audio. It's the ambient music. It's whatever happens. The sound designer is in charge of it. And again, kind of like animation, there are a lot of people who, if they are into sound, don't gravitate towards games. They would much rather do like live music or recording audio for film or doing music recording. So there are opportunities for sound designers at entry level. Lastly, you've got a community manager, and they are not necessarily developing games, but they're supporting the team. So they are engaging with the community at large. They are customer first responders, so anytime someone has a question about the game, they respond. They are working on promotions, so they're working with social media to get their game promoted. And the sort of game press engine, and they are working on support for players, existing players. Now, this position is becoming a lot. There's a lot of new companies that are establishing this position early, which is really good. And I would keep an eye out for different companies here in New Zealand that will work with a community manager. It's something that you might be able to do even as you're a student. But even if you're a recent grad, it's still a good position because, again, you're in the company, you can start talking to people, and you're a quick hire away in any one of those other junior positions. So don't dismiss this as something you would never want to do. keep it in mind because it's a great way of getting in, especially in New Zealand where companies tend to be small and they tend to hire people that they know. It's actually very rare in New Zealand for someone to get hired who doesn't already know people in those companies. Okay, whoa, my voice is cracking. Last slide, gamasutra.com. And this is my challenge for you this week is to go to gamasutra.com or go to the NZGDA and go onto the jobs page. Each one of these websites will have a jobs page. And I want you to wander through them, just kind of poke around and see what jobs are out there, see who's hiring and see specifically what kind of positions they're hiring for and what kind of experience that those companies are looking for from those hires. Because this will give you a good idea about what to expect 2 or 3 years down the line when you are graduating yourself and you start looking for your own work. So go on to either gamasutra.com or go on to the NZGDA, and the web link is from last week, but I can post it again this week. Take a look at the jobs board. Feel free to bring it onto the lecture discussion if you want to discuss, if you have questions about particular job titles, and share the link for that job position as well. Again, the more you know about the industry that you'll be going into now, the better, because then you can start to design your own position in that. So if you start to sense that being a technical artist is something you'd want to do, then start tailoring all of the work that you do here at Massey towards becoming a technical artist. And you will have a great portfolio by the end of 3 or 4 years. Okay, that's it for today. I'm just over half an hour. I'm sorry this took so long, but hopefully it was useful. And I will talk to you guys later. Thank you.